U.S. President Donald Trump's relentless attacks on institutions, the rule of law, and the press have left many fearing for the future of American democracy. So is the United States sliding into an authoritarian state? This week on UpFront, I'll ask one of the preeminent historians of fascism, NYU professor of history and Italian studies, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Delighted to be here.
In his inaugural address, U.S. President Donald Trump addressed how he survived an assassination attempt. He declared that he was, quote, saved by God to make America great again. Then weeks later, he went a step further. He said, he who saves his country does not violate any law. And he even likened himself to a king. How should we make sense of such declarations from a democratically elected president?
So these are classic pronouncements of someone who has been able to cultivate a personality cult, a leader cult in an authoritarian way. And Donald Trump, after the assassination attempt, was able to increase the robustness of his personality cult by pronouncing himself as having been saved by the will of God. And this went into an already existing discourse that he and his evangelical allies had created since his first administration, that he was in office by the will of God. And authoritarian leaders since Mussolini have had such discourses around them and cultivated such narratives. And in fact, Mussolini survived multiple assassination attempts in his first year as dictator. And the same discourse of he has survived these attempts because he's in office by the will of God was circulating in fascist Italy.
Now, it's particularly interesting for Trump because so much of his base is comprised of evangelical Christians. So this almost fits into a messianic narrative as well. Is there a historical precedent for that?
Yes, and since Mussolini going forward, authoritarian heads of state have had this narrative that they are placed in office by the will of God, and they have allied with religious institutions, whether it's Catholic or Muslim, doesn't matter what the faith is. What matters is the discourse that only he can save the nation, because the personality cult canons have amazingly not changed for 100 years. The leader has to be the man of the people, so he's relatable, but he also has to be the man above all other men, the man who is unique, and that's where the divine mission comes in. Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator, used to pause during his speeches and look up to the heavens to show people that he was getting divine inspiration. So this is a very old, I call it an authoritarian scam, because most of these authoritarians are extremely impious, corrupt people.
Well, that was going to be my question. It's not just the rhetoric, though. It's not just the performances that we have to think about when it comes to the Trump presidency. He's defied judicial authority on issues related to immigration. He's targeted political dissidents in a variety of ways. He's expanded executive authority over independent agencies. How do you describe this part of the moment that we're living in? I see the performances, I see the messianic cult stuff, but this is nuts and bolts policy stuff. This is affecting people on the ground. How do we make sense of it?
Trump is implementing the authoritarian playbook as it's been used and is being used around the world. And there's a reason that he always cites authoritarian despots, from Xi Jinping to Putin to Orban. It doesn't matter if they're right-wing or left-wing. It matters that they have absolute power. And so what he is doing now in the United States, attacking the judiciary, threatening judges, trying to rule by executive order as though Congress doesn't matter, that is a classic authoritarian thing. That eventually Parliament, as in Russia, the Duma, becomes like a rubber stamp when authoritarianism is very...
Let me pause you on that word, eventually. I keep hearing we're going to become an authoritarian nation. These are the signs of an authoritarian nation. But all the evidence of that seems to suggest that maybe we're already there. Would it be hyperbolic to say that we're not becoming an authoritarian nation in the United States? We are one.
It's always a continuum. And for example, in Turkey, where Erdogan has been an authoritarian leader for a long time, it took the recent arrest of Ekrem Imamoglu, the head of the opposition, and Erdogan had been threatening him for years, but it took the arrest of and imprisonment of the chief of the political opposition for some people, including in Turkey, to say, now we're an autocracy. So there's no question that the U.S. is in the process of becoming an authoritarian state. And every place has a different, is in a different place on that continuum. It's harder today to know when, quote, authoritarianism has descended, because today we keep elections going. There's something called electoral autocracy. So what you do today is you keep elections going, you keep opposition parties going, but you game the elections by domesticating the media, which is what Trump's trying to do, by taking away judicial independence. And that matters because if there's election fraud concerns, like happened after 2020 election, 60 plus Trump appointed judges turned back Trump's bogus election fraud claims. If you've domesticated the judiciary, that won't happen anymore.
You seem to have a deep, historically informed analysis of Trump. That analysis allows you to sort of see how each step has been somewhat predictable and foreseeable. But I got to ask you, is there anything about Trump's ascendance or Trump's presidency that you didn't see coming, or anything surprising about it?
So I have been writing about Trump and calling him an authoritarian since 2016. And because of my historical training, he is deeply familiar to me. And I was able, in 2017, writing for CNN, to predict many, many things that he did. And the same was true this time around. The one thing I did not see coming was the ascendance of Elon Musk to have what I'm calling a power sharing agreement with Trump. And there is one man.
Power sharing agreement. When you use that word agreement, I have to ask you, are you using that loosely, or do you think they actually have a formal or informal sort of pact to share the control of the United States government?
I believe there is a power sharing agreement because, yes, they have an accord. And that is why Trump allows Musk to be in the Oval Office speaking to journalists. So there are two guys in the Oval Office speaking to journalists. There are two guys leading cabinet meetings. Elon Musk has been having meetings with foreign heads of state on presidential property. He met with Modi, the Prime Minister of India, in Blair House, which is the presidential guest house, so it's official property. And they had two chairs with two flags set up as though they were each heads of state. So this is a power sharing agreement because Trump is doing the classic part of the authoritarian playbook. He's got the leader cult, he's going after the institutions, but Musk had everything. He's the richest man in the world. He owns Twitter, now X, but he did not have a way to infiltrate a sovereign nation, the government of a sovereign power. And so Trump allowed him to infiltrate using Doge. Doge was created as a vehicle for him to infiltrate.
That's the Department of Government Efficiency, excuse me.
The Department of Government Efficiency, which has no official federal authority. And yet Musk and Doge have actually taken over many federal agencies. And Musk is re-engineering government to protect his companies. So he's going after agencies that have had lawsuits against his products or his companies. And he's capturing data. He'd like to build a giant surveillance machine. And this has never happened before in the history of authoritarianism, that someone shares power in this way, because this is the first time that a private individual, the richest man in the world, has been allowed to, given the key to come into our payment systems, our data systems, and take them over.
This sounds like a soft coup.
It's a coup. I called it a coup in the end of January. It's a new kind of coup because his digital shock troops, who now have physical power, to lock out our elected representatives, as happened to Maxwell Frost, a representative from Florida, and others. And they're even going after, in the same way, they've gone after nonprofits like the U.S. Institute of Peace. They have taken them over. They have sent the employees home. And I study coups. The third of Strongmen is about coups. And so this is a new kind of coup, but it's done with Trump's full approval.
What's in it for Trump?
Well, Elon Musk was the biggest donor to Trump's election. And if Trump wants absolute power, he did not have the means to go, or the technological savvy to be able to take over government at lightning speed. The other thing that's new about this is the speed at which everything is happening, destroying government agencies from within.
Now that we're drawing these parallels between the United States and other authoritarian regimes, I got to ask you about political violence. Mussolini's reign in Italy was riddled with political violence. There were paramilitary groups that attacked trade unionists. There were secret police that cracked down on dissent. We saw political opponents executed routinely. Do you fear that this level of political violence will also take place in the United States?
It certainly could, because whether they're fascists or communists, authoritarians are people who believe that violence is a way you change history, thus revolutions and coups. And violence is a way you solve differences. And I've been following Donald Trump since 2015 on this issue. And it's very frightening because he's been using his rallies for 10 years now to emotionally and psychologically condition Americans to see violence as positive. And what was January 6th? It was the use of violence when all else failed to not only rescue the leader, but to change history, to forcibly institute an authoritarian state, because that's what he needed to happen. He needed to stay in power.
The violence I'm seeing is coming certainly from everyday people on the ground, as you just detailed with the January 6th coup or rebellion, I should say. But I'm also seeing it coming from the state.
Yes.
Immigration enforcement agents from ICE have operated in plain clothes. They've worn face masks. They've detained individuals off the street. They've transported them in unmarked vans. I mean, these are tactics and methods that feel not that different than secret police in authoritarian regimes. I'm thinking like the Gestapo. And again, maybe I'm going too far here. Maybe I'm being alarmist. I don't know. But there seem to be some apt comparisons here. What do you say to that?
You're not being alarmist. These masked gangs of thugs who are the state security forces, that's how you would refer to them in other countries, are showing up, as you said, in unmarked vans, using violence, harassing people who try to intervene, and bundling people away. We are now disappearing people. One of the innovations is that we're sending people to a foreign gulag in El Salvador instead of just incarcerating them here. But this surprise element where you're going about your life, you could be a U.S. citizen or have legal status, and a bunch of masked goons who are unmarked and refuse to identify themselves come to you. They come to your workplace. They get you in your car. This is exactly how authoritarian states operate. This was what the fascists did way 100 years ago. Bands of fascists would show up, and eventually they became the fascist militia, right? And they were a state security force. You had Soviet snatch squads who would show up and do this.
Wow. This is eerie, and it's very much, you make a compelling argument about what's going on in the present moment under Trump. But I want to explore what led us to this moment. You recently stated that President Trump is effective at convincing people that democracy is failing. For years, though, under Republican and Democratic administrations, there have been issues with voter suppression, systematic violence against minorities. We've seen the outsized influence of lobbyists and money in politics in general. There have been economic policies that have just deepened the huge gap between the have-gots and the have-nots. We've seen all of this happening. Even if one were to concede that Donald Trump is not the answer, isn't he still kind of right that American democracy is facing some real problems?
Around the world, democracies have been declining, and there are these polls, whether it's like continent-wide polls, Latino barometer, Afro barometer, and they poll many, many countries, and young people are often disaffected by democracy. That's because neoliberal policies have grossly increased inequality. People feel their needs are not met by democracy. The social places where the social safety net has been taken away. So this is a global problem. Donald Trump has been trying to condition Americans to believe that democracy is failing, not just as a social system, but as a political system. And there, of course, he's very wrong. But this is a moment of reckoning for the United States. We must interrogate ourselves very honestly and look at how our society and our political system has not been so democratic in many ways. And if anything good can come out of this nightmare we're living through, it is to open the eyes of people to the systemic and structural injustices, whether it's institutionalized racism, mass incarceration, dark money in politics. And if you look at our political system through the eyes of the study of autocracy, for example, the Electoral College, it's not only elitist, and so for many years, critics have said we should get rid of the Electoral College on elite because it's political elitism.
Yeah.
It's also unsafe. Anytime you entrust a small number of people with immense authority, as the Electoral College system does, that means they, from authoritarian eyes, they are ripe to being intimidated, manipulated, or worse.
Some people take it even further, though. They say it's not just the Electoral College, it's the actual two-party system that we have. I mean, Democrats and Republicans have a lot of significant consensus on really big issues: military spending, Wall Street regulation, surveillance, Israel, Palestine. We're going down the list of things where they're kind of on the same page. In fact, a recent NBC News poll shows that Americans have negative views of both political parties, with 38% saying that neither party fights for them. So in light of that, why do you think the two-party system here in the United States has been maintained for so long? And should it be?
It used to be seen in a very Anglo-centric way as the pillar of stability. But what if you have a bipartisan system and one of those two parties becomes an autocratic party? Then you've got a big problem because the system is static and fossilized, actually. And it also means that people who don't identify with an autocratic party and its ever more open racism and its practices have nowhere to go. And this is one reason that, for example, the Democratic Party has not been built to operate with flexibility in a crisis, because it's so large. And, AOC famously said that in a different country, she would not be in the same party as Biden.
That's a really interesting point. You often compare Trump's authoritarianism to the rise of authoritarian regimes abroad. But I want to stay domestic for a second. The United States has its own deep-rooted history of authoritarian and maybe even fascistic practices. The ethnic cleansing of Native Americans, slavery and Jim Crow, apartheid, Japanese internment, forced sterilizations, eugenics programs that influenced Nazi Germany. I mean, all this stuff is homegrown, and we didn't have to look anywhere else for it. Are comparisons to other countries even necessary, given the United States' own history?
They are necessary, but they're only part of the picture. And, the reason that America was both a beacon of freedom in the world and the backer of countless coups around the world through the CIA and the whole state is that there is this double heritage. And this is a moment of reckoning for the United States, because many people who were not subject to mass incarceration, to institutionalized racism, now have to open their eyes and say, well, it could be me. And hopefully learn about this whole history of racialized policing, mass incarceration, anti-Indigenous peoples, policies, and all of this, which has made the United States a very illiberal country as well as a democracy.
I guess I worry, though, that people, when they hear the language of we're becoming like Italy or becoming like Germany, makes it seem as if all of this stuff is due to outside influences, as if America itself wasn't organized and shaped around these very same things. Does it almost let us off the hook for our own history?
Yes, and many people don't want to admit, for example, that we had a regional authoritarianism in the Jim Crow South. And when people say, oh, we're such an old democracy, I always respond, well, actually, we're not. We're a very new democracy, because it was only with the civil rights legislation in the 60s that we became a democracy. So one thing is democracy as a political system. Another is democracy as it's actually lived at every level of government and civil society. And by those measures, we are a new democracy.
I have a small but vocal number of viewers who are probably pro-MAGA right now, who are hearing this and they're saying the reason he keeps winning is because he speaks for the everyday person. And the electoral results would suggest that lots of people wanted him to be president more than who didn't. Are we overanalyzing this? Is this just a case of Americans having a very clear idea who they want, and it's Trump?
There is some of that. It goes back to democracy seen as not working. And I do want to say this is a global problem. The solution, though, is the opposite of what Trump is now proposing, because the rights of the many are taken away. Right. So voting rights, reproductive rights, etc. And the very few have unheard of liberties to plunder the workforce, plunder the environment, because you deregulate, you privatize, and you allow the very few to profit in a way they never dreamed. So the very few having power in some places called oligarchy. And some people feel that that's an improvement to have competent people taking charge of things, the Department of Government Efficiency. But sooner or later, the history of authoritarianism tells us they find out that they've been scammed. And I've been using the word reckoning. I truly believe there will be a reckoning in America. As ordinary people, the children will get sick because of, there's already a measles outbreak. There's all this conspiracy theory and disinformation on health. Their Social Security checks may stop arriving. Medicare may be cut. Government systems will stop working. There'll be supply chain crises. We're already hearing about that. And all of this is intentional. The Donald Trump administration wants to completely paralyze government and create as much hardship as possible. And this is going to convince many Americans over time that they made the wrong choice.
So what's next? Trump, his presidency will end at some point, hopefully at the end of his democratically elected term. And then someone else is going to emerge. Will it be another cult-like figure? Or will we go back to business as usual? In other words, is Trump the start of a new type of leadership in the United States? Or is he a kind of outlier who won't be replicated anytime soon?
I think that Trump is setting things up systemically, as is Musk, as is Vance. And Vance is the kind of connector between Project 2025, the Broligarchs who have enormous power now. And it's very interesting that authoritarians don't like to talk about successors because they're supposed to be unique. But recently, Trump mentioned Marco Rubio and Vance. And Vance is very key to the future of America, unfortunately, in my view, because he embodies all of these power configurations that have come together. Project 2025, Silicon Valley. He's the creation of Peter Thiel, the billionaire who backed not only his private businesses, but his Senate race. And I don't think we can return to business as usual ever. With the wreckage of our federal agencies, the authoritarian takeover that we're now living through, perhaps a more just America can come out of this as people's eyes are opened to how undemocratic in some ways America has been. But that is a long-term project.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront.
Thank you.